days, having served as president, vice president, and program chair in the past. And now let's welcome David Schwam-Baird. Take it away.
Hey, hello everybody. Many familiar faces and some people I don't recognize. And I sort of come every October and usually talk about politics, usually talk about international politics in the Middle East. So I am going to talk about that today. And I'm mainly going to be focusing on the agreements that have recently been signed between the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Israel, because they have been greeted with a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of excitement. They are talked about as representing important breakthroughs. And to a certain extent, there is some reason to be cautiously approving of these things. It does sort of represent a breakaway from a sort of knee-jerk reaction to international politics on the part of a lot of different countries. But nevertheless, I did call this talk, America and the Middle East, even when things look better, it's bad, for a reason. Because, well, obviously being involved in this group, I'm obviously a skeptic, not just about metaphysical questions, but also about political questions. And usually there are so many different layers to what's going on, and the news tends to focus on the top shiny, pretty layer without looking at all the other ramifications. So I think there are some positive aspects to these agreements, but there are also some negative ones that people aren't talking about that need to be brought out. And there are other, of course, negative things going on in the Middle East that have not been resolved. And one of the main problems we have now, I don't think it's going to be a surprise to most of you when I say this, is we don't really have a coherent foreign policy or a coherent set of policies towards the Middle East or towards other countries. We have reactive policies. We are also sort of dragged along by other countries, and I'm going to talk about that also. So first of all, for people who've been watching the Middle East, the fact that the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and Israel did finally sign this agreement for normalization, which is what it actually is actually the culmination of a lot of under-the-table contacts that have been going on for almost 20 years. As a matter of fact, Israel and the UAE started cooperating on cybersecurity right after 9/11, because the UAE discovered that the terrorists involved in the destruction of the World Trade Center had been able to use banks in the UAE as a conduit for their funds going hither and thither. And they wanted to find a way to stop that. And Israel, being the leading technological power, among other things, in the Middle East, they made contact with them. And the Israelis, of course, were more than happy to cooperate in security efforts against terrorist activities of this sort. So it started with that, but very quickly it turned into other kinds of contacts, commercial contacts, etc. And within the last 5-6 years or more, the contacts have been more and more close to the surface. There's secrets that were deliberately not well kept, that the UAE and Oman and Bahrain were starting to deal with the Israelis. They were even inviting Israelis to come on official visits and opening up. So there is a long background to this, and these agreements started a long time ago. They weren't just something that came up in the last 2 or 3 years. The fact that they were made public and the fact that they are agreements that are supposed to lead to diplomatic normalization, that part is significant. And one of the things that that says is that in the Middle East, among the Arab countries, the long-standing stigma against Israel is starting to break down. As far as the UAE goes and the other Gulf states go, well, first of all, they have not recognized Israel. They have not done business with Israel, and they have, of course, in their propaganda, excoriated Israel. But they've never been at war at Israel. They don't have common borders with Israel. And I might start to share the screen now because I always like maps. So as you can see here, we're talking about, well, we will be talking about Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Oman. None of them have common borders with Israel. As a matter of fact, most of them are several hundred miles away from Israel, and they have supported financially Arab countries that have gone to war with Israel. They've supported a variety of terrorist groups and guerrilla groups that often engage Israel. But they've also been funding other political groups, militias, guerrilla groups, terrorist groups that are fighting different regimes as well. So that's sort of the way things work in the Middle East as far as that goes. But the United Arab Emirates and the other Gulf states are starting to think in terms of international business. Abu Dhabi and Dubai, which are both in the United Arab Emirates, have sort of boomed in the last 10, 15 years and have tried to create a new image of themselves as international financial hubs and cities of exchange of thoughts and conferences from all over the world, etc. And if they're going to be involved in finance or going to be involved in technology, Israel in the Middle East is the leading technologically advanced country. And so to exclude Israel from that is bad business. It might have been good politics for a long time, but business often wins out overall. There's something else going on, which also made it possible for the UAE and Bahrain to open up relations. And that's what's going on in Saudi Arabia. Several years ago, the Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, or MBS, as he's often referred to, seemed to take over the helm of Saudi Arabia, and he wanted to reform the country, not to make it democratic. He's pretty autocratic, but he wanted to change the image. He wanted to modernize it somewhat. He wanted to diversify the economy, and he also wanted to move in the direction of making Saudi Arabia something of a major hub for finance, for commerce, for trade. And he announced something called Vision 2030. And I'm going to sort of show the excitement. It's a lot flashier perhaps than pragmatic, but nevertheless, it does represent what he's trying to do. There's MBS himself. And it involves a lot of things, again, trying to make Saudi Arabia a major hub between three continents, as they say. One of the plans that they have is to create in the northwestern part of Saudi Arabia a technological and investment center. And it's close to the Sinai. It's not far from Israel. The fact that they want to put it up there in close proximity with Israel for future development is probably not an accident. And so the fact that Saudi Arabia is starting to think in that direction is significant. Now, the king has said Saudi Arabia will not have relations with Israel until there is a resolution to the Palestinian problem. And the UAE and Bahrain have also said to Israel that Israel has to stop its plans for annexation of Palestinian territory on the West Bank. And the Israelis have frozen their annexation plans in order to be able to sign this agreement. The question is that going to hold? And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. The main reason, aside from the commercial, that things like this are happening is because Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, with the possible exception of Qatar, see Iran as an existential threat. As far as they're concerned, the radical regime in Iran is out to undermine them, is out to surround them with connections to Shia-dominated Iraq, Alawite-dominated Syria, the Hezbollah in Lebanon. Also, some of these countries, including Saudi Arabia, have significant Shia Muslim populations. And of course, the Iranian regime is a radical Shia regime, while these countries are all Sunni. Just to show you what the problem might be for Saudi Arabia, this is the region of Saudi Arabia up here where the most intense oil prospecting and refining goes on. Guess which part of Saudi Arabia has a concentration of Shia population? Whoa, coincidence of coincidences, it's the same region, and it's right across the Gulf from Iran. So anytime there are protests, anytime there's any kind of agitation there, of course, the explanation isn't that the Shia population in Saudi Arabia is treated horribly. It can only be because of Iranian influence. And it's not to say that the Iranians don't try and stir up trouble. And Bahrain, very teeny Bahrain, is a country with a Sunni leadership, but 60% of the population is Shia. And so the fears in Bahrain that Iran would stir up the Shia in Bahrain are also pretty strong. And so the other consideration here is Israel, as arguably the leading military power in this part of the world, also sees Iran as an existential threat. And if you are really worried about the military intentions of Iran, you want to have the strongest military alliance you can in opposition. And so the Saudis and the Emiratis are starting to see not just the commercial advantages of being involved with Israel, but the military advantage of having an alliance with Israel against Iran. So many of the enemies of the Saudis and the Emiratis are the enemies of Israel as well. So that is a major push. Now, where it becomes troubling to me in this situation has to do with American policy towards Iran. So very briefly, Obama, during his administration, Obama actually was hoping to reduce our involvement in the Middle East, because we are spending billions and billions of dollars in the Middle East and Central Asia, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and in other conflicts as well. And we're getting nothing out of it. We're just losing blood and treasure and time. And he wanted to find a way to not abandon ship in the Middle East, but to pull out to a certain extent to be able to start to focus on South Asia and East Asia, where the shift in global economics and the shift in global politics seem to be going. The policy in the Obama administration was called the pivot to Asia. And one of the things that had to happen, according to the Obama administration, is there had to be sort of a resumption of the natural balance of power in the Middle East. So you have the biggest powers, the strongest powers are Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey. And Iran was, of course, isolated and out of the system, but Iran is one of those four countries I just named are the largest countries, are the most powerful countries there. You can't do anything. You can't pretend that you don't have to deal with them. And so his idea was not only to create an agreement with Iran that would push back their nuclear program, but if the agreement with Iran managed to push back the nuclear program of Iran, and it seemed to be succeeding in doing that with the inspectors, and the Iranians were keeping up their side of the bargain, etc. The hope was that would be a confidence building measure to make it possible down the road to possibly start to work out some of the other problems with Iran. One of the things that Iran wants more than anything else is to be recognized as one of the legitimate power brokers in that area. So that was part of the big plan. There were problems with it, but the actual deal with Iran, the GPCOA as it was called, which involved China, Russia, Germany, Britain, and France also were all signed on, which had an advantage, a whole bunch of advantages. Seemed to be working in that little corner. It didn't solve the other problems with Iran. It didn't stop Iran from financing terrorist groups. It didn't stop Iran from financing other political groups. But it seemed to get Iran to agree to push back its nuclear program. And there was also cooperation with Iran in fighting ISIS, because Iran was viciously opposed to ISIS, as were we. Once the Trump administration came in, the Trump administration, of course, repudiated the agreement, which was, in my opinion, the wrong way to go. Put back on the sanctions on Iran. And that was sort of the end of the policy. It's, we're going to do what we did before for years and years and years. It never worked, because this time it's going to work. It was that kind of policy. But it was also not followed up by other things. It created tension with our other European allies. The Germans disagree with us, the British disagree with us, the French disagree with us, the Italians disagree with us, and our alliance is breaking up there to the advantage of Russia. It opened the door for China to start to include Iran in its Belt and Road program, and it is now working with Iran to build a port on the Indian Ocean to, among other things, export oil. So it created an opening for Iran, and essentially our policy towards Iran and towards the Persian Gulf is now a policy of letting Saudi Arabia and the UAE tell us what our policy should be. That is not the way a major power should conduct its foreign policy. We've done that in the past, and it's been disastrous. We should have a coherent policy. I happen to think we should be engaging with Iran myself. But nevertheless, our policy is a reactive and drifting policy, which gets us into problems. Like, for example, the war in Yemen, which is a horrible, stupid, ridiculous proxy war with the Saudis supporting one side and the Iranians supporting the other side. And the Saudis have been buying our arms. We have been saying, yeah, take our arms, do whatever you want. And they're murdering civilians in Yemen by the thousands. And finally, when we said, hey, look, we have no control over this, we don't want this to happen, etc., it wasn't easy to get Saudi Arabia to pull back. And we still want Saudi Arabia to buy our arms. Well, billions of dollars of business. But we got involved indirectly in the Yemen conflict, which was not in our interest at all. And that's one of the problems you have with letting somebody else determine your foreign policy. So this, to me, is one of the negatives there, that it creates, or it builds into an increasingly confrontational policy led by leaders in the region, in Saudi Arabia and the UAE, whose approach to Iran is one of paranoia rather than reasoned policy. Yes, there is a reason to be afraid of Iran, but their approach to Iran is rather extreme, and we are allowing the confrontational aspect of the conflict to pull us around rather than do something to sort of control it. So I'm going to stop at that point. I want to go in a different direction. I have other things to talk about, but are there any questions so far about what I'm saying?
David, there's one that came in through the chat window. Can you explain the politics of the war in Yemen?
Okay. The situation, very briefly, because this can go crazy. In the so-called Arab Spring in 2010, 2011, one of the places where the established regime got into trouble was in Yemen. And the long-standing ruler in Yemen was kicked out, but there was something of a free-for-all in Yemen for who is going to take over. There is a group of tribes that are predominantly Shia. They're not all Shia, but they're predominantly Shia, an alliance in northern Yemen called the Houthi, named after one of their leaders. And the Houthi took over the capital, but the regional players and the United States and some other groups supported one of the Sunni factions that was related to the ousted leader. And so they kept trying to get the Houthi out of the capital, Sana'a, and to push them back up north. Well, this became a major firefight, you know, and the Iranians were backing the Houthi, even though it's a different strand of Shia Islam, but those niceties sort of go by the wayside in these things. And the Saudis were supporting their guy, and there were other groups too there, because there's a big Al-Qaeda group in Yemen as well that's trying to get their fingers in the pot, and there are a couple of other groups. But the proxy war was going crazy because the Saudis and the Iranians saw this as Yemen's sort of a little version of the Saudi-Iranian tensions. And so each one was fighting fiercely because they were looking at it in terms of their existential view of the fight there. And so the amount of bombing, of indiscriminate bombing that went on in an effort to just push the Houthi out. There were villages that were bombed. There were hospitals that were bombed. It was just crazy. And a lot of that, a lot of those munitions that were being used were American munitions. As a matter of fact, some of the locals, whether they were partisan or not, they would find pieces of American bombs. They would take photographs of them. They would put them up on the wall and say, America is trying to kill us, down with America. You know, and this was whether they were partisans or belligerents or not. Why do we need that? Why do we have to support that kind of thing? It was sort of a matter of being dragged in as opposed to making a decision, a studied decision to get involved. But that's essentially what it was. It was something that grew out of the Arab Spring and was sort of hijacked by Saudi Arabia and Iran and made into a very bloody proxy war. So, yes, Richard?
Yeah, I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I actually served 12 years in the Middle East. My last post was Abu Dhabi. I left in 2014. But I just wanted to underline everything you're saying, both in terms of UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Bahrain. They have two main strategic fears. One is Shia, Iran, and also the Muslim Brotherhood.
Right.
And so they look at those as both external and internal threats to their control. And so that's why they are working. They're happy to work with Israel because Israel has the same concerns. So that's one of the things that's driven Israel and these three countries in particular together.
Okay. Well, it actually gives me confidence that your experiences, at least so far, align with mine. But that's how I see it. Those are their main issues as far as that goes. Now, the other thing that I see as problematic goes back to Israel. And of course, those of you who know me know I'm a dual citizen, U.S. Israeli. Although I don't agree with anybody in the Middle East, I don't agree with the Israeli government, I don't agree with Palestinians, I occasionally agree with the Norwegians. The treaties that were made, okay, first of all, they weren't peace treaties because UAE and Bahrain weren't at war with Israel. They were treaties for normalization. That is to say, a process would be initiated which would ultimately, presumably, lead to diplomatic relations. And diplomatic relations, of course, have different levels until you get to full ambassadorial exchanges. So the idea is that it's a process. And as I said, the UAE and Bahrain had said they would only sign the agreement, and they signed it at the White House. They signed it in Washington in September. They would only make an agreement if the Israelis stopped their policy of annexing the West Bank, which is predominantly Palestinian in population, and would go back to engage in serious negotiations to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Now, the Israeli government in recent years has been top-heavy with right-wing nationalist parties who, for one reason or another, are in favor of annexing the West Bank. Some want to annex it in toto, some want to annex most of it. And part of the policies in the West Bank is that it involves expropriation of Palestinian land. It involves creating an infrastructure which has the effect of sort of isolating and excluding the Palestinians, even at the same time that it enhances the efficiency of transportation for the Israelis. So it's creating increasing burdens and pressures on the Palestinian community. From the Israeli side, the way it's presented in Israel is they're not ceasing annexation plans. They are freezing annexation plans. And that's part of the internal politics in the coalition government that's in charge right now in Israel. And even by agreeing to the freezing of the annexation, Prime Minister Netanyahu got a lot of flack from the more right-wing members of his coalition who said, no, we have a commitment. We are going to annex the West Bank. So the question is, what is this going to do in terms of Israel? And this, of course, for obvious reasons, is of concern with me. Israel obviously has serious defense problems with lack of strategic depth, having a history of hostile countries that have gone to war with it on its borders, etc. Although it does have a peace treaty right now with Egypt. It's had it since 1981. Well, 1979 actually, and a peace treaty with Jordan. But those are always described as cold treaties. They're sort of, we agreed not to shoot at each other a lot. That's sort of the basis of the treaty, okay? That's different than the treaties that the UAE and Bahrain are offering, which is, we want to do business with you. We want you to come to our conferences, to invest. We also want you to talk to Americans so the Americans will invest, et cetera. They're looking at it, at least that side, as a very lucrative business opportunity, plus all the things about defense and coalition against the Iranians together. And there has long been sympathy for the Palestinians, popular sympathy for the Palestinians in the Middle East. Just about everybody in the Arab world, in the Muslim world, is sympathetic with the Palestinians. They're not as sympathetic generally as they used to be, because this is like something that's been going on since 1949. And the Palestinian leadership itself has not, let's say, always conducted itself in a way that was going to guarantee the goodwill of Arab leaders. So, for example, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, the PLO, not only the PLO leadership, including Yasser Arafat at the time, not only said, hey, we're all on Saddam Hussein's side, they even did some scouting for Saddam Hussein's troops. And so after Saddam Hussein was kicked out of Kuwait, so were 200,000 Palestinians that lived in Kuwait. Because, hey, come on, you were living here, you were working here, and your leadership is helping the people who invaded our country. We're not sympathetic anymore. The leadership of countries like Saudi Arabia, Richard had mentioned that, you know, they don't like the Muslim Brotherhood. They also don't like Hamas, which is also equally as radical, and they're one of the Palestinian groups. The Palestinian leadership is split and divided into two rival groups. One is a more nationalist secular group, the PLO or Fatah, and the other is Hamas, which is a radical Islamist group. But whatever the case may be, the Palestinian leadership has always been too radical and scary for especially the conservative regimes. Jordan had a war with them in 1970, Black September. So they have always expressed sympathy because it was politically expedient. The depth of that sympathy we can question. So sort of giving up on the Palestinian question, which they're not exactly doing, that's not such a big sacrifice. So my reading, and this is totally subjective, is the Emiratis and the Bahrainis, who are still going to constantly say, we've got to resolve the Palestinian crisis, do justice for the Palestinians. My personal opinion is, and excuse my crudity, they don't give a rat's ass about the Palestinians. That's my personal opinion. And they just get in the way. They have to constantly make this obeisance to the Palestinian cause because it's politically safe and called for, but they're going to work on that. Now, the problem is, it's obviously a problem for the Palestinians who are losing any kind of effective support for their cause. But it's a problem in Israel because that lessens the pressure on the Israelis to actually do something constructive to resolve the Arab or the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And to me, it's a matter of a different kind of security issue, which is, and I've showed you this before in the past, I'm going to show it to you again, I'm going to share a screen again, about Israel. And I worked on this, I changed this. This is what I had shown last time I talked about, last time, this was about 4 years ago, I gave this presentation, and I redid the calculations, mainly based on the CIA estimates and some other information. If you take the area that used to be the British mandated Palestine and add to it the Golan Heights, because the Israelis have annexed the Golan Heights. In Israel proper, and by Israel proper, I mean, this being Israel, the orange area is pre-1967 Israel, and these hashed areas are the territories that Israel gained in this war in 1967. They also gained the Sinai Peninsula, but they gave it back in the peace treaty. So within Israel, before 1967, there are 8.5 million people, and of those, 6.5 million are Jewish Israelis, 74.4%. Well, when I gave this talk last time, it was 75.1%. when I gave this talk last time, somebody had remembered a talk I had given like 12 years before when this was 80%. So inside Israel itself, the proportion of Israeli Jews in the population is going down. Well, it's a Jewish state. It's supposed to be a state so that Jews can be independent and have national autonomy, but their share of the population is going down. If you add the West Bank, which some of the Israelis want to annex, that's another close to 3 million people who are Palestinians. There's actually something like 3.3 million, as you see here. The Israelis that have settled in the West Bank, these 420,000 Israelis, are actually counted by the Israeli government in this number. So if we added this, we'd just be double counting the Israelis. So if you add this together, then the Jewish population of Israel and the West Bank together is about 57–58% of the population. So if you're annexing the West Bank, you're diluting the population that you want to be a majority, that you want to have a country so it can celebrate its culture and develop its culture and be autonomous. That's going down, and the percentage of people who do not want to be part of your state is going up. And if you add to that the Gaza Strip, Israelis don't live in the Gaza Strip anymore, but Israelis essentially control the Gaza Strip from the outside, along with the Egyptians. It's mainly the Israelis. That's another close to 2 million. If you add all of those together, all of the population inside the old British mandated Palestine, out of 13.5 million, the Jewish Israelis make up now 48% of the population. In 2014, it was 51%. In 2008, it was 52%. So the area that they are trying to control is an area that's decreasingly Jewish, which creates that argument. Do the Israelis want a democratic state, or do they want a Jewish state? And the more the demographic political problem isn't resolved, the more it's going to be an either or thing. It's not a democratic Jewish state. It's going to be either a democratic state, where you have to give all of those Palestinians and others, it's not just Palestinians, it's Bedouin, it's Druze, it's Armenians, you have to give them voting, or it's Jewish and you deny rights to a huge part of your population. And so what I say is, now that the UAE and Bahrain, probably Oman, and under the table Saudi Arabia don't care, because they're more concerned with the anti-Iran alliance and with the economic opportunities. The Israelis now, with the right wing in charge who want to annex the West Bank, it's not going to be solved. I'm afraid there'll be a third intifada. Intifada was the uprising because the Palestinians are going to be pushed to their limit. There isn't too much chance that you're going to get 2 to 4 million Palestinians to leave. That would be creating another Palestinian refugee crisis, which would be unconscionable anyway. But if they go to Jordan, which already has 1 million Syrian refugees, or Lebanon, which already has close to 1 million Syrian, you're going to destabilize their neighboring countries, which is also not in your security interest. So by not having that pressure on, and I will say that it's a shame that the Americans had never really put pressure on, except for the first Bush administration. They were one of the few that really did in recent years, but they're the only ones. The Israelis are going to create for themselves an unstable situation. And I'm afraid that 20 years from now, Israel won't quite be the same, but it'll be pretty close to Lebanon with warring factions. And this is not even going into the factions inside of the Jewish community and inside of the Palestinian community. So it's not like it's just Israeli Jews and Palestinians. It's right-wing, ultra-religious Jews and secular Jews, and it's Hamas Islamist Palestinians and PLO secular nationalist Palestinians, and it's Jews from an Eastern background who came from North Africa or Iraq or Iran, and Jews from a European background who came from Eastern Europe. There are a lot of other ways the tension cuts, which is why I am deathly afraid that that Israel may become South Lebanon. And I'm not saying this will cause it, but this removes another possible pressure point that could delay it or change it or something. So those are the two negative sort of spin-offs that I get from this, from these new things. Again, there are positive aspects, but we are so far from resolving the negative aspects that I think they're going to come back and haunt us. So at any rate, that's the picture that I wanted to paint for you, which is very cheery, and I could certainly go on and add more detail. There are other conflicts to talk about and other strange arrangements to talk about as well, but I'm going to stop here for more questions, see if there are any more questions or comments. Yes, Fred.
I have a question about, is Turkey playing a role, more of a greater role in this with under Erdogan, or this strongman politics and extreme religiosity?
Yes, yes. First of all, Erdogan is moving Turkey further and further away from the Kemalist secularist philosophy that underpinned the republic for so long. But more important, I think Erdogan at one point was poised to have his dream of a powerful, influential Turkey almost realized just at the point that the Arab Spring broke out. Now, it didn't affect Turkey internally, but it just screwed the whole Middle East up that he was building his plan on, because he wanted to make Turkey the indispensable country. Turkey would have been the country that, if Europeans wanted to deal with the Middle East, Turkey was the country to go through. He was setting himself up in that position. And the Middle Eastern countries, their best way to deal with the Europeans would be through Turkey. And then it all fell apart, actually not through mistakes of his own, but he started making mistakes of his own after that, you know, added to the chaos. So one of the things that relates to exactly what I'm talking about is now Turkey has set itself up as much more of a rival to Saudi Arabia and to Iran than it was before. And to some extent, it wants to fill the void. And one of the ways it wants to fill the void is by becoming, it wants to position itself as, now we're the champions of the Palestinians who have been forgotten by all you guys. And this is an important cause for the Muslim world. Turkey, of course, isn't Arab, so that makes his connection to the Palestinians a little more tenuous. But nevertheless, he has been positioning himself to try and be more influential on behalf of the Palestinians. Whether it's because of a love of the Palestinians is another question, which I'm not so sure of. But he sees this as a possibility. And since his regime is, I don't want to say it's radicalizing more, but it's certainly becoming more ideological in a right-wing nationalist way. This is meant to turn up the heat in all of those questions. And that's aside from everything that's going on with the Kurds and aside from everything that's going on in Syria. He's also got his finger in that Palestinian-Israel pot. And he's sort of taking advantage now that, you know, the UAE and Bahrain are going in a different direction. So, yeah, Richard.
Yeah, can you comment on what I consider two of the biggest economic challenges for these Gulf countries in particular? One is what happens if there's a post-hydrocarbon age, and what are they going to do? And secondly, how are they going to employ their people? I mean, their people have few skills. They haven't exactly developed a work ethic. I've lived in Saudi Arabia as well.
Right.
I haven't seen much of it.
That is the $64,000 question. To his credit, I don't know how much credit I want to give, but to his credit, that's what Mohammed bin Salman wants to solve. His ideas might be a little bit dreamy, but he is talking about creating a non-petroleum related commercial sector. He is talking about getting in on the road to technological innovation, etc. He wants to diversify the economy. So he's at least aware of that. Now, he's got a lot of inertia fighting against him. Plus, you know, depending on who you read, criticisms of his Vision 2030, a lot of it seems to be sort of more romantic than economically robust. Okay, but it's in the right direction. Now, he shot himself in the foot. That's a bad metaphor under the circumstances, because he was lining up a lot of major companies and major figures in the West to invest in his Vision 2030 until the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And a lot of the investors that were there, and a lot of Western investors, big name companies, pulled out as a result. So in terms of the promised amount of international investment, that sort of dried up. That might be temporary, but you know, the autocratic side of him is sort of at war with modernize, let's cool things down side with him. But at least he's aware of the problem. Whether he can actually do that is another thing. And the other thing you mentioned was just the nature of the population in Saudi Arabia, especially, but these other countries as well. Most of the elite Saudi citizens are people who have a lot have been educated in the West, et cetera. The question is, what have they done with the education? They've got these cushy jobs and these cushy allowances, and they often, you know, their job involves remembering to come in once a month to pick up their paycheck. And it's a little bit of an exaggeration, but apparently not that little. You know, you have your experience. I've been reading other stuff recently that just talks about, I mean, that's a common theme. Westerners who have been there saying, you know, half of the people who supposedly run the country aren't running anything, and they don't want to run anything. They've had it so cushy for so long. There's very little innovation. There's very little application of whatever they learn, so it sort of goes to waste. There are some exceptions. Maybe MBS can put them on the right road. But all I can say in his favor on this is he at least recognized and articulated the problem. But it's not clear that he's actually capable of really moving things in the direction. And his sort of stumbling, especially on the Khashoggi thing, you know, shows that he's got a lot to learn himself if he wants to push this along. So is that where you were sort of going?
Yes, exactly. I mean, those are exactly the issues and the challenges. I mean, MBS has the right ideas in some ways, but I mean, you know, first of all, locking up all the sheikhs, the rich sheikhs in the hotel, you know, before Khashoggi also wasn't a help. I mean,
Yeah,
he's got a lot to learn.
right. Well, the locking up the sheikhs in the hotel, that was kind of interesting because I saw so many different interpretations of that. Because overtly he said, I'm not going to let the elite, including princes, get away with corruption. And so even these guys, I'm going to make sure they're going to pay off. Well, there were a lot of people who could have been on that list who were sort of buddies of MBS who somehow didn't find their way into that hotel that night. So it was more of a power play. I'm in charge. You guys toe the line. That's how I saw it.
This was the same time he himself bought a $400 million yacht and Leonardo da Vinci for $450 million. So it's hard to say that he's being legit.
Yes, yes. It's yeah. There's a big balancing act there. So you know, the smaller Gulf states. You know, it's funny to watch Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and sometimes I get them mixed up. But some of the investments that they've done are, I mean, building the airports and building the business centers and building that huge, I never can pronounce the name of it, that huge Al-Baj, is that what it is? The big skyscraper, the biggest?
Burj Khalifa.
Al-Burj Khalifa in the world, you know, but they're creating this image. And then they go out and they spend gazillions of dollars building those silly islands, palm tree shaped, and one's like the globe of the world, and they couldn't sell them to save their lives, and it's destroying the ecosystem off the shore, and it's like a total white elephant, and they're still talking about doing more. I mean, it's like they do brilliant stuff and then turn around and do the most ridiculous, foolish kind of stuff. But there is a lot of thinking in the way that especially Abu Dhabi is trying to make itself into a very important regional hub. And they're having some success doing that, but they're not Saudi Arabia. So I think there's a little bit of jealousy even between MBS and MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed in the Emirates, because he might, you know, if he were the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, he might actually be able to do some whipping into shape, because I think he's, from what I read about him, he's a little bit more on the ball. He knows a little bit more about what he's doing, but he's got a smaller country. So any other questions, comments, clarifications,
hey, David,
insults?
this is Mark. I've got one.
Yeah.
I think you said early on in your talk that you thought we should engage with the Iranians, or you'd like to see us engage with the Iranians. What did you mean by that?
Okay. For example, you know, the JPCOA, the agreement that we had with the Iranians that the Germans and the British and the French and the Chinese and the Russians were on board. It was engaging the Iranians. The Iranians were actually fulfilling their side of the border. They sometimes had to be nudged or slapped a little, but they were actually fulfilling it, which means while that was in place, they weren't developing their nuclear capability, or at least it was slowed down, put on the back burner. And so if indeed it would have been possible to use that as a confidence builder, and you could start to say, okay, we want to move this way now on a different issue, and you might be able to find some way to satisfy some of what they need in order to get them to stop financing Hamas, or whatever the case may be. To me, that's the way to go. Engagement is always the preferable default. Doesn't always work, but it has more promise. And what was interesting at the time in the controversy, I meant to get it. I got one of them, but I couldn't find the other one. In the New York Times in September of 2000, there were a couple of these. 2015, when the controversy was going on about approving the JPCOA, there was a 2-page full ad of Israeli generals and intelligence officials and diplomats all signing, saying, essentially, we disagree with the prime minister who's making this sound like nuclear war is going to start next Thursday. And we think, even with its flaws, this is the best deal to have right now in the Middle East to work towards getting Iran off the track to build its nuclear capabilities. There was, the general of that was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs in Israel made a speech saying, this is actually a better deal for us. He didn't love it, but he said, this is better than anything we've had going before. So there were a lot of intelligence people, a lot of generals, a lot of diplomats in the United States, in Israel, and elsewhere, who from their professional point of view said, this isn't great, but this is like the best thing we can get right now, where the politicians, especially the populist, shall I say, demagogic politicians like Netanyahu, were making it sound like the apocalypse is next Thursday if we don't stop it. But the popular view always went to the populist politicians and not to the people whose profession was to evaluate what is best for the security of Israel or the United States, et cetera. And that engagement, some of the criticism for it was, well, the Iranians are still supporting terrorist groups, and the Iranians are still causing trouble in Iraq. And the answer was, this isn't an agreement about that. When you make an agreement, you never make an agreement that says, we want A, B, C, and D, so you enter into the agreement so that you will totally agree with us on every point. That's not how you negotiate. You never get everything you want, but you get a better situation than you would have gotten if you hadn't engaged. And the JPCOA, in my opinion, got a better situation, not the best situation, but got a better situation than not engaging. And the current administration's position is, don't engage, just keep hammering them. Oh, you mean the Chinese came in through the back door? Oh, we didn't expect that. Why not? Because we don't have a policy. And our policy, to me, is being essentially made in Riyadh and not in Washington. That's how I feel. Richard.
I just wanted to add, I mean, the argument about supporting terrorism, I think is disingenuous. There are Saudis and Emiratis and Kuwaitis who have given money to Al Qaeda and all of these Salafist groups that have been supporting terrorism as basically protection money. It's like, if you build a Tiffany's in the South Bronx, well, you got to do something to protect it. You buy the people off who might attack it. Right. And secondly, Iran's a country of 80 million people. You've got to deal with it. It's right across the border from all of these countries.
Right. Yes, that's exactly the point. So you engage it. This isn't the only problem. It's one of many problems, but part of the problem with dealing with Iran is a proud country. Iran has a culture that goes back thousands of years. Iran wants to be respected as a major power. And if you started doing that, it wouldn't solve all the problems, but it would take you 2 steps closer to solving the problems. If you recognize the legitimacy of their saying, we're a player here, don't pretend we're not. Doesn't mean you love the regime. I don't like the regime at all. Although, in some ways, however much I hate the regime, it's anti-democratic, it represses its citizen, it also, throws dissidents in jail and kills them. But if you have a scale of 1 to 100 on the democracy scale, and, Western Europe is up in the 80s or whatever, Saudi Arabia is like -5, and Iran is like at 10. It's not a democrat. I mean, it's a semi-democratic country. They have elections, of course. The regime says, you can't run, you can't run, you can't run, you can't. Okay, you can run. So how democratic is it? But there's something there. And women are in the parliament, and women can be doctors, and women can go to university in Iran, and they can't in Saudi Arabia. So in terms of my disgusto meter, which both of them score very high on, Iran's a little less than Saudi Arabia to me. So, Ken, did you have a comment?
I do. I have a couple of questions. I'm very happy that Richard is on. And David, I've learned a few things, as I always do from you. And Richard, I'd like to address this to you and David, if I may. David, you in your talk mentioned the trend of the Israeli population and how it's becoming a little bit more diverse. And this is causing somewhat of a dyspepsia, perhaps, among the Israels who are there because they believe this is a country that has been set aside just for the Jews. And it's not supposed to be diluted with other types of individuals. Religion enters into this equation. Culture enters into this equation. Where people were born enters into this equation. Lots of money enters into this equation. So my first question is for the average person walking around the streets in America, on a scale, as you mentioned, a scale of 1 to 10, where does this fit on their pain level relative to what they should be focusing on in terms of what's going on in America? How much should we actually be paying attention to it? Or should we be grateful there are people like Richard Eason who are over there or were over there handling a lot of the issues for us? That's my first question. I have two quick follow-ups.
You want to ask him later?
Well, yeah.
Let Richard go first.
Well, just a comment. I mean, you know, when you're in the State Department, if your president decides to invade Iraq over specious reasons, there's not a whole lot you can do except to resign from the Foreign Service. So, I mean, there are certain things we can do. The political leaders sometimes do things that none of the experts in the intelligence, military, or diplomatic areas support. But just wanted to make a comment in terms of Israel. You know, all you've got to do is spend a few days in Israel, spend some time in Tel Aviv, and then drive to Jerusalem, and you'll see the divides that affect Israeli society.
Yeah.
Right, and David was talking about that divide and how much even the Israelis cannot get along.
Right.
All right. All right. My third question is going to be asking you to address that, but in between that, how much has the U.S. propagated the discord in the Middle East?
Oh, that's like a 4-volume book. Because we have done some good things in the Middle East. It's not like everything we touch turns to dog poop, you know. We have done some good things. We've also done some bad things, and we've also failed to do some things we should have done, which is a different kind of, you know, sin of omission. You know, there are certain things I think that in the last 20, 30 years, the worst thing we did was the invasion of Iraq. I mean, because that led to the whole ISIS thing in its own way. That led to all sorts of other problems. And we're still paying the price. And not only are we still paying the price in terms of instability and things like that, but the people who designed the policy, who it turns out knew not quite as much about the Middle East as my dog. They thought, I'm talking about Cheney and Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz, they thought, get rid of Saddam Hussein, we'll put in a guy we like, Ahmed, what's his name? Ahmed...
Chalabi.
Chalabi, there you go. who was wanted for fraud in Jordan at the time, but that's a different problem, who was popular among literally dozens of Iraqis. And he would have led Iraq to democracy, which would have then passed this democratic torch on to everybody else. I mean, that's like fourth grade political thinking, really. I mean, he didn't understand a thing. So we go in there thinking we're going to do this, thinking essentially we're going to make Iraq into an ally of ours. It's an ally of Iran now. So we have actually increased Iran's influence in the Middle East by having invaded Iraq and doing it the way we did, which was particularly stupid anyway. So, and that spun off so many things. Like I said, that was the root, not the root cause, but that was the catalyst that eventually led to the whole ISIS foolishness in there. So we have done some pretty bad things, and we have some other policies that are based, I don't know what they're based on. Don't get me started on Afghanistan. Anyway, but you asked, there was another part of your question. You said, what is the average American? What should we want to be going on there? What should we want our government to do? And in a way, that's a divide in America. So for example, if you talk about Israel, you have two main groups in the American public that are exceptionally concerned about Israel. One is the Jewish community, and one is the conservative Christian community. The conservative Christian community love Netanyahu. He's a little too moderate for him, but they love Netanyahu and go get those damn Arabs and just beat them and do whatever you want, and Israel should expand, and they know nothing about Middle East politics. The Jewish community, which is very supportive of Israel in principle, is divided among themselves. And some are like me, who are opposed to Israeli foreign policy, and there are a lot who are uncomfortable, which is different than being imposed, but uncomfortable with Israeli foreign policy, and a lot who are, yeah, go get him, Netanyahu. And there are also a lot of American Jews who are concerned about internal politics there. But if you're talking about the group politically that is the base for, say, anybody, including President Trump, but not excluding others, who just want Israel to go and do whatever it thinks it has to be done, that's the conservative Christian bloc in the United States, about 20% of the voters. You know, the Jews themselves are all over the board on what they think Israel should do. They support Israel, but they don't always support its policies.
Richard, do you have?
Just a comment. I think you shouldn't underestimate the reservoir we have of soft power in the Middle East with the Arabs. You made reference to the fact that a lot of them went to school in the United States. Most of the people in charge of anything in the Middle East went to college in the US. So they not only know how to deal with us, they speak perfect English, but they know how we think, but they have wonderful memories of their college years like everybody does. Unfortunately, that is passing. In Saudi Arabia, for example, they're building their own universities. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, the Crown Prince, did not go to school overseas. Right. That is changing, and that's a real concern for the longer run. But I mean, you know, we also did things like build the American University of Beirut 150 years ago. The elite of the entire region go there, including my Palestinian Jordanian wife. I mean, it's where all the top students for the region go, and also the one in Cairo now as well. But I mean, you know, we have, and you know, I'm sorry, but even Michael Jackson was a big thing when he went to Bahrain 25 years ago, whenever it was, 20 years ago. I mean, we have enormous reserves of soft power that we can use.
So that leads me to my final question, my third question, and is what are the steps that we should be taking to try to assure relative peace in the Middle East so it's not, you know, front page news?
Okay.
What I'm going to underscore is what you just said, Richard, is there's trade that's involved, there's education that's involved, there's a humanitarian aspect, exchange that's involved. For example, the Peace Corps, is that worthwhile? I think that, personally, I think that's one of the greatest exports that America has ever created, my personal views. But if we were to take that kind of philosophy and extend it into the Middle East, am I being naive, or is this the way it works, or is it just too much money for any of this to even be considered? Speak to it.
I would just comment, I mean, it's not a question of too much money for the Peace Corps. There's also something called the International Visitor Program, where an embassy picks out some up and coming local government official, sends them to a program in the US for a month to learn about the judicial system or the healthcare system or something. And they come back, and in 20 years, they'll be the health minister or they'll be the minister of justice. So those programs cost nothing. I mean, one F-35 fighter would pay for all of these programs and more. So it's not a question of the money. It's a question of just focusing on it. And it's also a question of, talking to the people who've spent their lifetimes living and working in these places in our embassies before you make a decision to do things like invade.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a big part of it. But, the idea of the soft power is important. So one of the parts of the UAE Bahraini agreement with Israel is good, because to the extent that business and commerce and exchange of ideas and investments becomes the thing that's front and center, you have more opportunities to break down a lot of the other stuff. And you have more people meeting who wouldn't meet otherwise. And those people who are meeting are also tied to this prime minister, this member of parliament, this general, whatever. And that kind of facilitation, if properly used, that goes a lot more, or it doesn't go a lot more, it goes more towards creating that kind of network that you need in order for people to be ready to make peace and to negotiate in good faith. When it's just negotiation for show, that's not going anywhere. You're just doing it for the home crowd or for your political party or whatever. But increasing that international commerce and bringing people in and essentially saying, yeah, we have political differences, but this is where the money is and this is where the information is. That's not a bad way to go, and we should be encouraging it. And I'm not a big fan of Trump, and Trump didn't do this because it's been in the works for a while. But to the extent that he facilitated it, you got to give him some credit. But you got to take advantage of the connections that you have, and at least in that small step, he did that. You just have to do that more. But overall, I don't believe we have a cogent, coherent foreign policy at the moment. I think it's just slapped together. Oh, you read this on Tuesday, you heard this on Thursday and Saturday. Yeah, I guess this will be our policy this week. And you're not getting anywhere with that.
Just one quick thing. We have been here before. I was in Oman from 92 to 95, and the deputy Israeli foreign minister visited, Yossi Beilin. That was the time of the Madrid talks, and things were going well. And then Rabin was assassinated by an Israeli radical. So and that basically knocked that whole thing off track. And now here we are 25 years later, maybe getting something going again.
Yeah. But that just shows you the problems inside of Israel.
Yeah.
It was an Israeli who assassinated the Israeli prime minister. It wasn't a PLO terrorist group or something.
Fred, did you have a question?
I'd like to comment on the influence of the extremist, fundamentalist Christians in this country, who would really like to see more turmoil in the Middle East, because they think many of them think that'll bring about the second coming and paradise and or whatever, however it works. But also the Saudis funding extremist schools throughout the world to teach their extreme version of their Islam, and how much are those problems that are kind of adding to the fire?
Well, it depends, because there are extremists and there are extremists. So, you know, actually, at this point, I want to tell something of a funny story, because in the Bible, it has rules about sacrifices in the temple. Okay, and both certain reactionary Christians and reactionary Jews believe that we're not that far away from the temple being reestablished. And so you have to have the sacrifices again once you have the temple reestablished. And so there is a rancher out in, I don't know where he is, like Texas or somewhere like that, who is trying to raise a red heifer with no blemish, because that's what you have to sacrifice. And, you know, it takes a while before you get get the one right. And he is being aided by some Jewish groups, okay, who also want this. They want to be ready to make the sacrifice at the temple with this unblemished red heifer. And when you read about this, one of the things you find out is the Christians think they're using the Jews to get what they want. And the Jews think, they're using the Christians to get what they want. So each one thinks the other side, they're dupes. They don't know what they're doing. We got the real truth here. We're the ones that are going to kill the cow when it you know, finally comes up pretty soon. Of course, I read about this 5 or 6 years ago, and pretty soon is getting longer and longer away. But that happens a lot in religion.
Well, it's going to happen at the second coming.
Yeah. Well, for the Christians.
Pretty soon.
There hasn't been a first coming for the Jews.
Right. All right.
Work
That's
like that.
true.
So, yeah. But, you know, but there have been radical groups. There was many years ago, but there was a plot by some ultra-religious Jews to blow up the Dome of the Rock, and they were caught by the Israeli Secret Service. Well, they're the Shin Bet, the equivalent of the FBI, and some of their financing came from Christian groups too. But that's not everybody. That's not the average Christian. Even the average, very conservative Christian who is going to vote for somebody who's going to support Israel to the hilt, they're not blowing up things. They're not, you know. But what they want is the fulfillment of their prophecy, which is why they don't believe in compromise. They don't want Israel to compromise.
Wasn't Iran at one point considered more or less secular? And can you speculate on what it might be? Would you be willing to go out on a limb if you could imagine what it might be like if there were no religion in the Middle East?
It would be like Canada.
Richard, do you concur?
Oh, yes. Just take it out of there.
I mean, you know, however secular I might be, I mean, I have to say, you know, when I went into the Cathedral of St. James in the old city of Jerusalem in the Armenian Quarter, I mean, it was one of the most beautiful buildings I was ever, very mysterious, very Eastern church. And I had a similar feeling when I went to the Dome of the Rock, which is one of the most beautiful buildings I've ever seen. And there is, I mean, you want that heritage there. You want the thing that makes it this special place. All you really want is that it be without all the crazies. You know, I have this theory, I probably told some of you, this crazy theory that one day down the road, there's going to be some excavations. They're going to go 10 miles down in the earth under Jerusalem, and they're going to find this huge deposit of highly active plutonium, radioactive plutonium, and that's going to explain why anybody who comes to Jerusalem goes nuts. I mean, it's just like it's an attraction. It's like a magnet, you know. But it's a beautiful city. It's an amazing city. It's you know, the cross section, and as long as they're not fighting with each other, oh, but do I have stories about that? As long as they're not fighting with each other, it's actually amazing and beautiful in its own way. But, you know, in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, from time to time, Greek priests start fist fighting with Armenian priests. I mean, it's on film. I mean, what's going on there? Anyway, so yes, Richard.
Yeah, just two comments. One, the problem I have with our current policy, embracing Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and then, you know, pushing off Iran, is that we're basically getting involved in the civil war that goes back to 640 AD. It's between the Shia and the Sunni. It is never going to go away. We don't need to be taking a side. We need to be trying to stay out of that thing, for one thing. And secondly, most Muslims are not giving money to terrorists. They certainly aren't giving it to them knowingly. I mean, they are in charge with one of the 5 pillars is zakat, is to give money, you know, to the mosque. So they do that, and sometimes you know, it gets in the wrong place. But that's one of the things that the U.S. government works with: terrorist financing restrictions, to get these governments to ensure that this money doesn't end up in Al Qaeda's pocket. But I guarantee you, there are sheikhs here and there who are giving money directly because either he's their cousin, or, you know, they don't want him to attack their business interest in Somalia or something.
Well, there's another dimension to that, which is I think confusing, but nevertheless important. But for example, and I had been looking into this in the Egyptian case for some time, but the Egyptian government, for example, is known for its corruption and known for its inefficiency. Okay, and it's a country with a huge population of poor, marginal, precarious, you know, people with precarious economic lives, etc. And groups like the Muslim Brotherhood, obviously they had their political arm and radical arm, but they often were the ones in the neighborhood who set up a clinic because the government didn't do it, or set up a training center because the government didn't do it, or set up a school because the government didn't do it. And so, first of all, some people were giving money to the project, not thinking we're giving money to the Muslim Brotherhood. And on the other hand, people in the neighborhood, they're thinking, okay, I was in trouble, couldn't find a job, and I got a job through the Muslim Brotherhood's job program. My brother-in-law was sick and he couldn't get into a hospital, and he was able to get treated by a doctor provided by the Muslim Brotherhood. After a while, how many people are going to say, when push comes to shove, who's helping me, the government or the Muslim Brotherhood? And this is how the Muslim Brotherhood builds its popularity. But on the other hand, there is not nearly as much pressure as there should be. Not that we could solve the problem, but we could certainly put pressure to begin to solve the problem. We don't bug the Egyptians to clean up their act. And it would be self-defense for them to clean up their act. They wouldn't have had to deal with Morsi and, you know, that whole thing. But, you know, they had the elections, they had Morsi, they got rid of Morsi, they got al-Sisi, and as far as I can see, it's business as usual.
Yep.
So,
just one other comment. Hezbollah and Hamas also do the same thing.
Yes, exactly.
They provide a local government and help people out in trouble, so they get support that way.
Right.
So does the Italians in New York City in the 1930s, the mafia. That's how they got. That's not nothing new about that kind of a behavior.
Exactly, except for the mafia. They had their connections, but they weren't doing international terrorism on a big scale.
Okay, all right. May I make this one observation? You made a reference to the crazies. And I wonder, if it weren't for the crazies, would we have the same degree of motivation?
Well, some crazies blow up buildings. Other crazies make statues. I like the crazies that make statues or play punk rock. I'm not going to buy their albums, but let them make punk rock.
Or the wacky tattoos, that kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of ways to be crazy, and some of them won't hurt you, and some of them will. I just don't like the ones who will hurt you. So,
okay,
you know.
Right. Any other questions?
I was just going to comment. It seems like some of the radical right, anti-government right in this country They're trying to put us in the same situation as in Egypt. Where the only people, a place where people get help is the extremist churches.
Well, it's not, we're not nearly at that degree because, you know, Egypt is an extremely extreme example. An extremely extreme example. I got to work on my adjectives. But, you know, there is something to that when you don't have a policy and you let other people have a policy for you, whether it's domestic or foreign policy, right? I'm concerned with the foreign policy, and to me, we've got too many people making our foreign policy for us. And that has led us into trouble in the past. You need a coherent policy. Yeah, you make mistakes with a coherent policy too, but having no policy just doesn't get you anywhere, except for in trouble.
You know, we all accept that there's a foreign policy, and we hear that all of the time, and we accept, oh, there must be a foreign policy, but I'll bet we could go around the room and go down the street and ask any number of people and say, well, what is the United States foreign policy? And then the answer comes back, well, it depends where you're talking about. Which part of the foreign world are we going to consider? So is there such a thing as a cohesive foreign policy?
Well, even when you have a foreign policy, you know, the best foreign policy, things happen, they pop up. You never expected a revolution here. You never expected a famine there. You never expected assassination there.
So
you know.
then the policy is what you go to if you have to cover these things, and then
right. But we have had policies, and we've had policy. To me, one of the most brilliant moments, not just from a technical policy moment, but also an ethical moment, was the Marshall Plan. Brilliant policy. Absolutely brilliant, covering all sorts of levels, including humanitarian, and it pretty much worked the way we wanted it to work. It can happen. It's rare, but it can happen.
That was probably successful because of the situation under which it found itself.
And the people who were running it. You didn't have a
I agree there too.
You didn't have a Rumsfeld running it.
That's true.
So,
that means it was well chosen.
So there is somebody who has a question. Where is the Abu Ben Adam, the Mohandas Gandhi, the Martin Luther King, the peacemakers that will inspire a new generation? And yeah, that's a heartbreaker for me. And again, because it's Middle East, I'm thinking Israel. When I lived in Israel, I was involved in the peace movement. And I knew some people who had certain visions, including some Palestinians who had certain visions. There was somebody there, oh, I can't remember his name. His first name was Mubarak. I can't remember his last name. And he was trying to bring a Gandhi-based strategy to Palestinian resistance. He didn't want to go with the terrorist groups. He didn't want to go with PFLP or whatever. And he was trying to have, sit-down strikes and boycotts and things like that, but totally nonviolent. And of course, the Israelis arrested him and kicked him out of the country for not being violent. Well, there's a good policy, isn't it? We want to discourage terrorism, so we're going to get rid of the guy who says you shouldn't be a terrorist. Yeah, that was brilliant. So it's hard to say. And the peace movement that I was in, I mean, in Israel, it's sort of been reduced. I had been at a demonstration of a couple of demonstrations of over 100,000 people in Israel for peace, at least two. And I had been in a lot that were much smaller than that. And the peace movement can't muster, they can muster a few hundred people now. So it's very discouraging. I'm not sure where among the Palestinians, where among the Israelis, the peacemakers are going to come from. But you're going to have some clever people. Yitzhak Rabin wasn't a perfect man, and neither was Anwar Sadat, but they at least were visionaries, and they were willing to do what it takes. But I don't see a lot of people like that on the horizon, unfortunately. So I wish I had a good answer to that.
Hey, David, I think Jeanette Emerson has a question. Go ahead, Jeanette.
Yes, Jeanette. Jeanette, how are you?
Hi, David. I'm doing great, thank you. So this has been an incredible presentation. Thank you. I'm almost embarrassed to ask this question because it's a embassies for dummies question. Because I'm so confused by the hoopla over moving the American embassy to Jerusalem. I don't really understand it completely. And I was wondering,
Okay.
how does that all figure in?
Okay. First of all, the symbolism of Jerusalem in the Arab-Israeli conflict is this. So, 1967, let me get my map back up. Is this it? No, this is it. There we go. So, in 1967, Israel, before the war started, is this orange part. So it captured the Sinai Peninsula and the Gaza Strip from Egypt. It captured the West Bank from Jordan, captured the Golan Heights from Syria. So when it captured the West Bank, up until that time, Jerusalem had been a divided city. The old city of Jerusalem, most of the religious sites were in the hands of the Jordanians. It was on the Jordanian side. And the modern part of Jerusalem, the part that had sort of blossomed from the 1940s, 1950s, was on the Israeli side. So the original Arab position was that the claim of the Jews to a modern homeland in Palestine was illegitimate in the first place. They came from outside, they came to territory that was part of the larger Arab area in there and included Jerusalem, which was a holy city for Islam as well as Christianity and Judaism. And so they didn't recognize the legitimacy at all. So at first, the position of most of the Arab states was, we got to get rid of Israel. Israel has no right to be there. Then Israel gets the West Bank, Israel gets Jerusalem, and Jerusalem is like that much more of a sore point for the Arabs and for the Muslim world. And so what happened was, most countries that recognized Israel for the longest time had their embassies in Tel Aviv and not in Jerusalem, because they also wanted to have diplomatic relations with Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Jordan, who opposed recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital. So when you have your embassy in a city, you generally have your embassy in the capital of the country whose government you're representing to. And so that was always a big issue, and there were tussles, and Israel was always trying to get countries to move their embassy to Jerusalem, and Arab countries were always trying to pressure countries to move their embassies out of Jerusalem. And for the longest time, most countries had their embassies in Tel Aviv, but moving it to Jerusalem was a sign you were not agreeing with the Arab countries, you were agreeing with the Israelis. And it was also a sign for the Europeans and the Americans that we are sensitive to the pain of the Arab countries in seeing Jerusalem under Arab control. We'd rather not even have to deal with the issue, but we're not going to antagonize the Arabs over this issue, partly because we want to remain a potential negotiator in good faith between the two sides, So we want to maintain relations with countries on both sides, and we don't want to aggravate unnecessarily Arab countries. So that's why it was a big issue. So when the United States moved its embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, it essentially said to the Arabs, we don't care about your position anymore. We only care about the Israeli position. And so that sort of went against the tradition that the Americans had, that we want to be able to be the good faith negotiators, the go-between, and so we're not going to antagonize the Arabs. And suddenly it wasn't an issue. But it's all symbolism. It's all symbolic. But symbolism means an awful lot in politics. And if you're a diplomat or a political analyst, you have to realize it. You might think a symbol is absurd or nationalism is absurd. It doesn't matter if you think it's absurd. It's a political force you have to recognize.
Oh, no, I totally get that. Yeah. Have any other countries followed us now? Has it started a migration?
I think there were a few Central American countries that moved. I think Guatemala moved its embassy to Jerusalem, and there might have been a few smaller countries. The ones, European countries still want to maintain that, we also would like to be like, your second choice for a mediator if you needed one, and we don't want to unnecessarily antagonize anybody. Other smaller countries, it's, some have moved, especially those who would like a nice aid package from the United States. So, a parallel to this, just to give you an idea, this isn't the only place in the world this happens. China, the People's Republic of China, for years and years and years, has had a campaign to try and get countries to reduce their diplomatic relations with Taiwan. And instead of having an ambassador, you have a representative instead of, because their position was, hey, there's one China. So what are you doing recognizing two Chinas? Even though they had a one China, two, what was it called? One China, two
Systems.
Policy. Ultimately, they were trying to outmaneuver Taiwan and the United States by pressuring more and more countries to not have ambassadorial relations with Taiwan and to reduce them, because that enhanced symbolically Beijing's political position and sort of isolated Taiwan more and more. So the whole symbolism of how you represent your government to another country, where it is, how you do it, it's not just the Middle East, it's not just the Arab-Israeli conflict. It happens in other places too.
Thank you so very much, David. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
Eric was mad at me for giving a hard time to artists.
Yes, I am mad at you for giving a hard time to artists. I think that to suggest that people inclined to terrorism, if I recall what you said, or the equivalent of artists are just crazy, or political extremists are crazy, and artists are crazy. I reject that equivalence altogether. I just have to.
Okay. I don't think I was making an equivalence. I think I was saying you've got choices to make. These are better choices.
Well, I would certainly agree with that, but I think that begs the question or the distinction that I'm trying to establish, which is that they are two very, very different approaches to one's life in the world. And
they definitely are.
One is clearly preferable to the other. I totally agree with you on that. But I would not like to suggest that our artists are some other failed political extremist.
Okay. Or it goes the other way.
Hitler. Okay.
Yeah, Hitler. Yeah, there you go. That's your.
But the premise of the original premise was the crazies was the umbrella under which that discussion happened.
Yeah.
The crazies. And my suggestion was, we may all be motivated because of the crazies.
Uh-huh. Well, at any rate, I have to be careful in my delineation of different categories of crazy. I think that's the point here. So point taken, Dr. Freiberger.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Schwam-Baird. I thoroughly enjoyed your presentation tonight. Very nicely done.
Oh, thank you,
And
sir.
I also very much enjoyed Richard Eason's contribution. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Richard. That was a very nice compliment. So, and I appreciate it. So,
Thanks.
especially since you mostly agreed with me.
All right. Well, we can keep the line open for a while if people want to hang around and chat. But I want to call sort of the formal part of the program to an end. And thank you, David, for your presentation and comments from others. And
thank you all. And I always enjoy talking to this group. I prefer to talk to people face to face, clearly, but I'm glad this worked out this way.
Maybe next year, or we can hope for that.